the last 10 years in Bengali history, in terms of the politics, what's been going on in terms of the radical politics of the state. I've been, since I also write in Bangla, which is my native language. I have also, I mean, I've just came out with a book last month, and I have been trying to write a series of poems, very different from the
What?
ones that you have read, which are mostly based on women's history, especially middle class women's history. And I think that this has been one of the things I struggle with, that how does one deal with gender and the poetics, the radical poetics, right? So if you
Yeah,
read historians and my earlier work, much of the stuff that I was writing were kind of focusing on domestic spaces, domestic labor, and in some ways there's a deeply classed middle class women's history, and I was speaking directly with the Bengali women poets who write about domesticity, oftentimes kind of throwing back a certain kind of anger at them, not exactly in taking their way of
what?
representation. I was also
Mhm.
reading a lot of the Anglophone women poets. And since I was living in United States, I was based in United States for 15 years, and we can talk more about it. And I was based in universities. You could not actually stop yourself from coming in contact with the MFA programs, right? So the
Yeah.
kinds of poetry, the kinds of poems, especially around gender, that the MFA poetics um, produced. So I was also in interrogation with them. At the same time, I was also in conversation and reading a lot of the Black women poets. So gender formed a big part of my work. But what I also did not like, that I was getting identified as a domesticity poet or a poet of domesticity. And I think that there are reasons why women oftentimes find it difficult to write that what I call the public lyric, right? Especially if you
Mhm.
read the subcontinental poems in Urdu, in Bangla, in Hindi. Public lyric is what occupies that primary space of secular, progressive, liberal poetics, right? And I think that there
Mhm.
are real reasons why actually women find it difficult to write those public lyrics, precisely because their spaces or their kind of location within those publics are not, they cannot be taken for granted. But at the same time, I was trying to get back to that mode of public lyric, and the poems that I'm working on right now, the manuscript, it's tentatively titled Inheritance of an Incompetent Rage. So, and that's kind of an attempt to um, experiment with the public lyric and to move away from the kind of the space of domesticity and kind of the stag as a domesticity poet. So Rebot Fashimals, which you have read, it's really, I see it as a kind of a much it's a kind of a much smaller in scale. It's really a transition book between historians of redundant moments and the one that I'm working on right now.
In Rebought facsimiles, you write, to be a self aware Anglophone poet in India is to be forever engaged in the exercise of listing the spaces where your poems would not be listened to. That's that's a really poignant sort of line I took away from the book. And when we're thinking about language and us as South Asian scholars or people interested in literature and those things and the realm of South Asian English language literature and poetry, uh, on one level, English is a colonial language imposed by violence, and it shapes the very conditions of silence and speech. But do you think breaking with the syntax and form is a way of reshaping the power in language, or how do you view this contradiction of sorts? Uh,
Thank you for that question, Cher. See, that way I see it, that we South Asians, when it comes to languages, we are caught in this catch 22, right? There is no South Asian language which has not acted, or I should say almost no South Asian language which has not acted as an imperialist language to other minor, quote unquote, minor languages. And there is
Yeah.
no South Asian language which also hasn't been subject to some form of domination, some form of colonization. So, I mean, it's a very difficult terrain to negotiate, and I don't think a lot of the other languages in this world actually have to keep on negotiating this terrain. And
Hmm.
and I think in the subcontinent, there is this great thrust towards claiming English as an Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi or just a subcontinental language, which I would say yes. But at the same time, it's not, I mean, let's not have this illusion about English, right? That it is a subcontinental language in the way Hindi, Telugu, Bangla, Urdu, like the thousands of languages we have in the subcontinent, there are. So in some ways, I think English is different. If it has become a subcontinental language, it has become one through a long continuing colonial and imperial process, the process that kind of continues in one way or the other. It's classed, and
Hmm.
precisely because of that, it also has been claimed by a lot of the minority groups. And I mean, English makes it possible for you and me to interact. I mean, possibly you and I could have still talked to each other, but there are the friends I have with whom without English we cannot really communicate. So I think it's our tragedy and possibility at the same time. So playing with syntax does do that work of um, kind of subverting English to a certain extent. And oftentimes I think we do it without necessarily being aware. So I mean, I did not grow up in a very Anglophone kind of a space, but I did know English. I could write relatively grammatical error free English even before I went to United States. But it was a rude awakening for me when I sat in the American classroom and I was told repeatedly that my English is not good enough. So in a way, what I
Yeah.
was writing without knowing it myself, I was subverting what is American English, what is kind of British English. So in a way, and I tried to kind of retain that, but also at the same time, because I've stayed for so long in United States, I have also picked up a lot of Americanisms in my language, so which I think contrasts the earlier generation of the subcontinental uh, Anglophone writers who were picking up Britishisms in their writing. But I think that my generation was also relatively free from trying to impress the British or the American poetry institutions or writing institutions. And there
Hmm.
have been moments like when I tried to deal with the American poetry institution, I literally got a feedback. I still have it on my email somewhere and I can send it to you when I find it out, that post-colonial, I used the word post-colonial, and the feedback was that oh, it must be a very rarefied kind of a word. And I mean, I
Yeah.
actually had to resist myself from shooting back, like, no, it is not. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
that you don't really know about it. So I mean, I think that
Yeah.
mm, in a way, having to deal with the American Poetry Institution taught me a lot of things about myself, about the subcontinent, and about the kind of the global south at large. That what does it mean to actually take the British or the American institutions, literary institutions, writing institutions, on
Hmm.
your own terms, and if you can ever do it. And for me, the answer is no. So I think that there is a certain kind of playing with syntax inbuilt into my English, and oftentimes it's not a deliberate act. It's the way we speak. It's the
Yeah.
way we
Yeah.
communicate with each other.
Hmm. And uh, as a writer, as a poet, uh, how does the question of where your work reaches and who it doesn't reach play into your work?
Yeah.
because you obviously love what you do, but there's also that sort of feeling of that your work is made for a certain neoliberal or sort of different circuits
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
circulation. Yeah,
I mean, first of all, I don't think my poems reach a whole lot of people. And in a
yeah,
way, I'm both fine with that and a little bit sad about it, right? Precisely because
yeah,
it's a double-edged sword. And before we
which is
go,
what you write.
which is why, right? But before we go into that, um, I think one of the things all independent presses struggle globally is not necessarily production, but distribution. Um,
Hmm.
and it's
It's a
something
huge
that
problem.
it's a huge problem. So you can produce a book, you can also make it to be a really beautiful book. But if you were not reliant on Amazon and also oftentimes relying on those sources of distribution, it's not at all
Hmm.
cost effective. There are lots of inbuilt economic conditions. So, how do you
Hmm.
actually get your book or the work you were doing to your friends whom you do, and you might not even know that you have friends in other parts of the world, in other parts of the country. So distribution is a
Hmm.
huge issue, and oftentimes I think the writers and producers have to take up the work of distribution, which also becomes a complicated sort of an affair because it looks like you are continuously advertising your work, right? So
Hmm.
and that's also, and then it kind of feeds into the neoliberal machinery. So I think that
Hmm.
distribution has been a huge issue. I have faced that challenge quite a bit. And given that
Hmm.
literature festivals in the subcontinent and especially in India right now are tied to the big corporations, and I refuse to kind of be put up as, I mean, I have been to some of these festivals during the early days of my like writing life.
Hmm.
I don't think
Yeah.
much happens creatively. I have been there just to keep an open mind. So, as a writer, as an artist, I would say that not much happens creatively anyway. So, it's not even that you can get a lot out of these processes. As a creative person, as a critical person, in terms of your craft, these are spectacles which are meant to be spectacles. But on the other hand, I think that there are uh, right now the festival scenario, the literary festivals, and there have been critics about it, um, and some very vocal critics about it, are deeply tied to the corporations and what I would call the corporation sponsored genocides in the subcontinent, right? And I
Yeah.
refuse to be the face of that, even if it means that my poems are being read only by 5 people. And can we actually, I mean, I guess the question that I often face, that can we actually avoid coming in touch with the corporations in our lives? No. Can
Hmm.
we oftentimes afford to not work for the corporations? No. So I have no problem in saying that I have been a worker for the corporate university for as long as I have been doing this work. I'm a privileged worker, but I also go into the spaces as a worker, which is very, very different from going up on stage and giving them the space to actually use your face as a writer, as an artist. So even if though it's completely impossible for me or for you or for us to avoid the corporations or the existence of the corporations in our lives, I think it is possible to reduce the amount of complicity we actually show in terms of our engagement with them. And the reduced complicity is an important aspect of our existence if we have to retain our sense of criticality. Not that we
Yeah.
always do that as middle class writers, artists, academics, critics, whatever name you give to ourselves. But it is an important um, way of life. I believe so. So that puts a lot of pressure on us to build up other networks, other kinds of radical friendships, radical solidarities, which I think we are doing by doing this kinds of
Yeah,
shows,
yeah,
by speaking to each other. Uh, but at the same time, I would be the first one to say that I don't think that my work reaches too many people. There is a power in that. Um, and I don't know if I go up on a festival stage that's been sponsored by any of the corporate um, houses. Would that actually get me more audience, the kind of audience I want? I don't think so. It would possibly get me into the drawing rooms of more, like, the powerful and the wealthy, but I don't see it as an access. I do think that there are other kinds of festivals, weak as they are, like the kind of the people's literary festivals, which are being organized throughout the subcontinent on a much smaller scale. And whenever we can, showing up for those spaces, or even building up those spaces, organizing those spaces ourselves, can be a powerful mode of actually getting our work across to each other. So I believe in this power of having my work reach to one more person who sort of understands it, and then that person actually gets it out to five of their friends. The way things
yeah,
work and the way things have historically worked for us. And I think that, again, given that what we have seen in the last few years, the clamping down on the digital spaces, I think that even
yeah,
as we keep on using the digital space, there is no actually substitution for the real life friendships, even when they are mediated by the digital spaces, and getting ourselves to do the hard work of kind of this
yeah,
clandestine and underground passing of our work to each other.
yeah. We have to become more fugitive in our
Correct.
practices.